Welcome everyone. We will be commencing soon in a couple of moments. Please take a moment while waiting to introduce yourself in the chat area. Tell us where you're from and where you're zooming in from. Thanks so much. Hi, Joe. Hi, Sharon. For those that are joining us, please let us know where you're joining in from. We'll be commencing in a couple of minutes. Great to see some activity in the chat already. Good afternoon, Knut. Welcome from Lower Hutt, Wellington. Hello, Steph. Greetings from Auckland as well. Hello, Catherine. From Chorus in Wellington as well. Yeah, we in Auckland are working from home as well. Hopefully this lockdown goes away soon. Excellent. Nice to see some activity on the chat box. Okay, everyone, I would like to advise everyone that this webinar is currently being recorded and will be available to all attendees in the following week. Just before we start, some Zoom keeping, which we are all very familiar with now. All attendees have been muted during the presentation. However, please use the chat box to write any comments you have and would like to share with all panelists and all attendees. We want to keep this webinar interactive and engaging. If you have any specific question you may wish to address directly to Tanya, then please enter them in the Q&A box and we will attend to your questions directly at the end of the Q&A session. Okay, so tena koutou, tena koutou, tena koutou katoa. And also a very special mention to all my Indian friends. A very happy Diwali today. We have over 50 registered attendees for today from not only New Zealand, but Australia and the Pacific Islands too. So very warm welcome to everyone. And I am pleased to say that this will be the first of a CIPS MBIE collaboration. In the new year, we hope to bring many more relevant and educational webinars for you. By way of introduction, my name is Avi Pranesh and I am the CIPS New Zealand Country Manager, and I am your main representative and contact in New Zealand and the Pacific Islands as well. A little bit about CIPS, for those who don't know us, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, or CIPS, is your global professional body for procurement and supply professionals, dedicated to promoting best practice, continuous improvement in professional standards, and raising awareness of the contribution that procurement and supply management can make to organizations. In this introductory webinar, MBIE, with MB, Tanya Donaldson, Manager of Employer Systems and Assurance from Employment New Zealand MB, will build your understanding of worker exploitation and the steps you can take as a procurement and supply professional to assure ethical and sustainable work practices in your supply chains. Incidents of worker exploitation are increasing the demand for ethical and sustainable work practices in New Zealand and abroad. Procurers can play a key role in preventing worker exploitation by taking steps to assure themselves that workers within their supply chains are treated fairly and in compliance with employment standards. Now to introduce our host, a little bit about Tanya, our speaker for today. Firstly, thank you very much, Tanya, for doing this webinar for us. I was very much looking forward to this. Tanya currently leads the Employer Systems and Assurance team in Employment New Zealand as part of MB. The team sits alongside the Labour Inspectorate and employment mediators. They have a focus on influencing and enabling government and business leaders to systematically take greater ownership of how workers are treated across their organizations and the organizations that they engage with, for example, as employers, as procurers, franchisers, recruiters, directors, and investors. Tanya's interest in fair workplaces was ignited when she joined the Labour Inspectorate in 2015 to lead the regulatory response to the Widespread Holidays Act non-compliance issue. Before that, her career had been in business advisory space as both as an employee and also as a consultant to a range of public and wider sector entities. Now, without further ado, over to you, Tanya.
Thanks, Harvey.
Thank you so much.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Happy Diwali and warm Pacific greetings to you all. Today I'll be talking to you about fair workplaces and how your work can support them. As Harvey mentioned, I work for the Labour Market Regulator and we have a focus on fair workplaces. So why are fair workplaces important? Moving on to the next slide. Fair workplaces are important for things like ensuring the health, safety, productivity and well-being of your workers and maintaining the quality of the products and services that you provide to and the goodwill and loyalty that you earn from your customers. A fair day's wages for a fair day's work. This is an age-old adage that I grew up believing was true in New Zealand. But since I've been in my role here at Employment New Zealand, I've learned that it isn't the truth. Sadly, a number of employees don't get a fair deal or even their minimum employment standards. So what do you know about employment standards in New Zealand? Can we do a quick poll to see how many of you know our current minimum wage rate? It's available on here, $18.90 an hour, $22 an hour, $22.10 an hour, or $22.75 an hour. So it looks like about 69% of us picked $20.10 an hour. Unfortunately, that's the current living, or actually it's not, that's the previous living wage rate. So that was the 2021 living wage rate. Our actual minimum wage from the 1st of April 2021 is $20 an hour, which I think I've done a typo in the poll. So I want to really apologise because $20 an hour should have been the second result that was on there and it wasn't on there. So I apologise for that. That will be on me. So to the people who picked $22.10 an hour, you did absolutely pick the one that was closest to the minimum wage rate. Really sorry about that. So let's see if we can do a better second poll. And see how many of you are also aware of the New Zealand Asian minimum wage rate in New Zealand. Is this a rate that you're aware of or not? This is a simple yes or no, so I'll give you answers. So fantastic. You all answered no, you're not aware of the New Zealand Asian minimum wage rate. That's a good, because these are black market rates that individuals within the particular ethnic communities in New Zealand are prepared to offer and accept for work. I first heard about the New Zealand Asian minimum wage rates at a workshop in 2018 when Dennis Mugger of First Union was speaking. At that time, the minimum wage rate in New Zealand was $16.50 an hour, and the rates Dennis told us about were $12 an hour for Filipino workers and $8 an hour for Chinese and Indian workers. He indicated that if these rates weren't accepted, the workers were blacklisted within their communities. And then once he finished speaking, another member of the audience confirmed that such rates existed, indicating that her Myanmar community, the rates went even lower, and they sat at $5 an hour for farm work and $3 an hour for other work. So that's a significant underpayment when you think that the minimum wage then was $16.50 an hour. Obviously, disparities like these are exploitative for the workers, and they create an uneven playing field for businesses by allowing non-compliant employers to severely undercut employers who follow the rules. And it's worth noting that not all exploitation in New Zealand involves migrants, because I know these were migrant worker rates that I was giving an example of, but that's not quite our context. So next slide, please. So what is our context? In 2019-2020, the Labour Inspectorate completed 588 investigations on employers. 56% of those involved workers who had migrated to New Zealand in the last 5 years, and that's what we classify as migrant employers within the Labour Inspectorate. But that means that 44% of them didn't involve those types of people. So they might have been young people, low-paid people, possibly low-skilled. But there's a lot of vulnerable people who aren't always migrants or new migrants to New Zealand. And increasingly what we're seeing is companies being held to account through mainstream and social media for employment standards breaches. And that's what this slide is really trying to show. On the slide here, the cleaning company that was fined $37,000 for exploiting staff was a company that was based in the Waikato, and the company and its director would pay the $37,500 to 6 members of staff who were exploited. The issues that they found in that case were failing to pay minimum wage and holiday pay, failing to keep accurate records, and charging a premium to have a work visa. So can we just do another quick poll to see what people know about charging fees for employment in New Zealand? So is it legal for an employer to charge a fee for employment in New Zealand? Yes. Yes, but not more than $10,000, or no? Fantastic, another great answer. So 92% of people said that it's not legal for an employer to charge a fee or a premium for employment in New Zealand, and you're right. So this includes not being able to charge an employee money in exchange for giving them a job or keeping them in a job so they can work under a work visa. In the next example on the screen, we can see a Lower Hutt construction company was fined $42,000 for unlawful wage deductions. In this case, the $42,000 was made up of $21,000 in remediation to 3 migrant workers and $21,000 in penalties for making unlawful deductions. Those deductions were for things like accommodation and for training that the workers didn't even attend. In New Zealand, you can't make deductions from people's wages without their agreement, and they have to be for things that are allowed. You can't just charge people for things that didn't occur. And lastly, on this slide, at the bottom of the slide, you can see that reference to the Housing Minister asking Kāinga Ora to review the processes after illegal workers were detained. This is an interesting case where we found 8 people working illegally on building sites connected to the Tamaki Regeneration Project. In this case, the workers got their jobs through WeChat and didn't know who their employer was. They were all paid cash in an envelope, and they received that envelope through a letterbox. Only one employer of one employee ended up being identified in this case, which just goes to show how difficult it is often to find out what's going on and how disconnected often the workers are from who they're doing work for. All of these non-compliant businesses tarnish the reputation of their sectors, as well as creating an unfair and unsustainable competitive advantage by undercutting the businesses that are striving to do the right thing. And COVID-19 adds to the challenges in this space, as some workers and workplaces are suffering deep, far-reaching and unprecedented adverse economic and employment impacts. However, there is a positive side, as our next slide shows. So this slide is just showing a couple of examples of the way that stakeholders are increasingly demanding that businesses show ethical and sustainable work practices in relation to how workers are treated within their organisations and supply chains. In the case of the Better Futures report, what we've seen from the results of that survey are that 76% of Kiwis would stop buying a company's products or using their services if they heard about them being irresponsible or unethical. It also found that 59% of respondents said that it's important to me that my future employer is socially and environmentally responsible. These results are also supported by the findings of the National Consumer Survey in 2020, which said that knowing a business treats its workers fairly always or most of the time affected 50% of respondents' decisions on where to purchase. The other group of stakeholders shown on this slide is investors, represented down the bottom of the slide there by Lawrence Fink, who was the CEO of a 6.3 trillion fund, BlackRock. I'm sure that fund has potentially gone up by now. But back in 2018, what Lawrence Fink did was send out an annual open letter to CEOs where he urged every company to articulate its purpose and how it benefits all stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate. His 2021 letter, which came out earlier this year, mentioned that they are seeing that companies with better ESG profiles are performing better than their peers and enjoying a sustainability premium. It's this type of focus that sees people looking to invest in companies supporting them having a social purpose and pursuing strategies for achieving that long-term growth. In terms of legislation, we'll see on the next slide that as well as many other countries having implemented modern slavery legislation like Australia, the New Zealand government is now considering introducing legislation that requires businesses to report publicly on transparency in supply chains to help eliminate practices of modern slavery. In 2020, Cabinet agreed to introduce a new duty to prevent employment standards breaches. While details of the duty are still being refined, the current indications are that anyone who has significant control or influence over an employer will need to take reasonable steps to prevent employment standards breaches across their domestic supply chains and contractual relationships and networks. In this space, significant control or influence could be through, say, having contractual control over an employer's business affairs, or being in a position to influence employment matters in a supply chain because the third party is able to set conditions which control market access. Government's also considering modern slavery legislation, which could potentially have related transparency and or due diligence requirements in respect of both domestic and international supply chains. They're also considering how these two pieces of legislation might come together and work alongside each other. So what about procurers, your particular area of interest? Next slide, please. What we're seeing is that procurers are also increasingly increasing their expectations on their supply chains. And Catherine, I saw earlier that you're on the call from Procurers, so you probably know about this case in much better detail than I do. But no doubt many of you will remember the Chorus Ultrafast Broadband Connect case. In this case, Chorus's subcontractor agreements had instructions around subcontractors needing to follow all New Zealand legislation and representing Chorus, and indicating any damage to the reputation of Chorus would result in discontinuing of the contract. However, Chorus didn't undertake due diligence to ensure that this was occurring. And by 2016, reports had begun circulating of worker exploitation 2 tiers down the Chorus supply chain. Procurers responded to these allegations by looking into the matters and came out publicly saying that they'd assured themselves that any breaches involving their contractors were isolated cases. However, when their Labour Inspectorate did an investigation in 2018, what they found was that there was potential employment standards breaches in 73 of the 75 employers they initially investigated. You need to remember in this case that for that particular piece of work, I think there was about 365 odd employers involved at the bottom of the supply chain. So we've done a targeted proactive investigation of employers. The breaches that the Labour Inspectorate found included failing to provide employment agreements, failing to maintain employment records, and failing to pay employees minimum wage and holiday entitlements. In a number of cases, the contractors deliberately used practices such as volunteering or extended trial and training periods without pay. The Labour Inspectorate in this case issued a relatively early media release, and it was the release of that media about the case and the associated reputational risk that presented that stimulated leadership from Chorus, even though they weren't legally responsible. So the day after the media release came out, we met with a number of senior executives from Chorus to discuss the issues. And by the time they arrived in our offices, they'd already engaged with Martin Jenkins about reviewing their business model, which is a really great activity to have occurred. So Chorus subsequently investigated the rest of their business and responded to the Martin Jenkins review findings by initiating a raft of improvements to their contracting model. This included implementing a supplier code of practice, minimum requirements across the supply chain, auditing, improving the awareness of their migrants workforce in terms of their employment rights and obligations. And they also implemented and promoted an independent whistleblowing process for their workers. And you'll see on the screen that as part of their processes, Chorus ended up blacklisting a number of companies from this. If you haven't seen the Martin Jenkins report, it was a good read. It's relatively easy to follow, and it provides a lot of lessons that are relevant to all businesses with subcontracted supply chains. So together, across all of these stakeholders, we're seeing more conscious consumers, investors, financiers, procurers, and suppliers. And what this means is that we're all becoming more labour rights aware, and we're seeing businesses and supply chain assurance rapidly becoming a standard requirement of doing business in New Zealand, which takes us to the question of, what can you do as a procurer? Next slide, please. As a procurer, you can play a role in changing the stories you've heard today by building fair treatment of worker considerations into your procurement processes. We've produced some guidance on what this can look like, which is available from our Employment New Zealand Procurers approach to assuring ethical and sustainable work practices and supply chains webpage, which you can see a snapshot of here on the screen. There's a lot on this page and connected pages. So today I'm just going to highlight a few of the checks and actions that you can take during the plan, source and manage stages. And I encourage you to go and look on to the webpage if you're interested in seeing more. The next slide introduces the plan stage considerations. So when you're planning your procurement, you should start by creating a supplier code of practice, code of conduct or work practice policy if you don't already have one. At a minimum, you should cover in this the expected behaviours you want to see, compliance with legislation, business ethics, treatment of workers and environmental standards, and a channel that workers can use if they feel their employer is breaching this code. Can we just do a quick poll to see how many of your organisations have a supplier code of conduct that includes fair treatment of worker considerations? Again, this is just a nice simple yes, no type poll. You all have one. Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm not sure why you guys are here. You're already preaching to the converted. So if that's the case, I'm really sorry. That's fantastic to see that you've all got that in place. Fantastic work. I'm guessing in the Q&A then the questions are going to go somewhere quite different, perhaps. Okay, but we'll still carry on through here because maybe there's something that you can learn in this space. So another thing that we recommend considering is whether there is an increased risk of employment standards not being met by your suppliers in the markets that you procure from. And to do this, you need to be undertaking a risk assessment. Some of the characteristics that you need to be cautious about include, say, sectors that have a history of human and employment rights issues, sectors that use a lot of migrant, or young or older workers, and industries that use unskilled, temporary or seasonal workers. Further risk factors in a risk mitigation table can be found on our ethical and sustainable work practices website contact. If you're looking at an existing supply chain or project, then we strongly recommend that you map your supply chain before you conduct your risk assessment. The next slide introduces some of the source stage considerations. So as with any business arrangements, it's really important that you do your due diligence. So this helps to avoid any unnecessary risks in the delivery and productivity of your supply chain, reputation and brand. As a first step, you should clearly specify employment standard requirements in your tender documents, including your suppliers, getting your suppliers to detail the makeup of their supply chain and their processes for auditing compliance with employment standards and dealing with employment standard breaches, and also for managing changes to their key subcontractors, because you want to make sure that if they're changing their key subcontractors that you're aware of it, because they might be changing to someone that increases the business. You should also ask potential suppliers about whether they're a party to any current or historic investigations in relation to employment standards, breaches, or labour inspector investigations. I'm just going to grab a quick drink of water, sorry. And if they are or have been asked, you should ask them about what actions they have taken or they are undertaking to address those issues, so that you can see if you're satisfied with the response that they're taking. You can also check to see if they appear in the stand down list available from the Employment New Zealand website, which details employers who have received the penalty for breaching employment standards as a result are subject to a stand down from their ability to support visa applications for migrant workers. There's also databases available that show you cases that have been to the Employment Relations Authority and the employment courts. In addition, and lastly, you should make clear your expectations of your suppliers' behaviour in respect of treatment of workers from the beginning, including their need to make their own suppliers aware of your expectations as well. Suppliers should commit and confirm that they understand the requirements and will comply, and it's our recommendation that they do that in writing. You have that in writing. The next slide introduces the managed stage considerations. So, monitoring your supplier compliance to your work practice policy or code of conduct should occur throughout the life of the contract. It can't just be a set and forget sort of a approach. Based on your risk assessment, you'll have determined the suppliers or areas of your business that present the highest risk of non-compliance. And these are the areas that we think should be monitored through, say, annual audits and or surprise spot checks. It's also good if you can use a worker voice tool to confirm the findings of any audits, so that you're sort of triangulating the findings to make sure you're not just hearing from the employers, but you're also checking what the workers are saying is consistent. If issues are identified, you should try and work with your supplier in the first instance to put in place systems and processes that remediate the employees and rectify the employer's systems and processes to prevent these issues from happening further and repeating. You should also ensure your suppliers inform their employees of their employment rights and obligations. They should also pass this obligation on to their suppliers or subcontractors. In this space, there are some related resources available on the Employment New Zealand website, including a free employee introductory online learning module, which is available in English, Simplified Chinese, Hindi, Korean, Samoan, Tagalog, and Tongan. To avoid unknown risks to your projects and business as usual activities and to your reputation, We believe suppliers should be required to inform you promptly if they are investigated for or are found to have committed a breach of employment-related legislation. So this includes both employment standards, it also includes health and safety or immigration requirements. A barrier to staff raising employment issues is being able to do so confidentially and anonymously. To help this, you can provide perhaps or make available a confidential point of contact for workers to raise issues. If you are one of a number of organisations that have the same suppliers, it might be that you could work together to provide these types of platforms. In undertaking your due diligence, of course, it's likely that you may come across it. And so then the question is, what do I do when I find issues? As I said before, we believe that if the issues aren't serious, then the best thing to do is to work with your suppliers and support them to remediate their employees and rectify the issues identified. However, what do you do if there's a serious breach? And what makes for a serious breach even? Next slide, please. So we consider the following breaches to be serious. Exploitation, where there has been calculated abusive conduct that marks serious departures from employment standards in respect of vulnerable workers. This primarily would be involving breaches involving, say, the minimum wage, like we heard about earlier in the presentation, or charging of job premiums and unlawful deductions from wages. We also see systemic breaches as often being serious. And these are breaches where maybe the actual breach itself doesn't have a particularly large consequence for the individual employees involved, but when you aggregate them together, you find that the consequence is quite large. So in our mind, say, if you think the potential arrears is $100,000 or more, or affecting 20 or more employees, then we would believe that would be constituting a serious breach. And lastly, non-compliant businesses. In this space, the kind of thing we're talking about is things such as, say, the practice of salary averaging that we used to see quite a bit in the dairy sector, or the inappropriate classification and casualisation of workers. So, for example, perhaps treating workers as contractors when their work arrangements mean that they should actually be treated as employees. In cases like these, we really encourage you to contact us on either of the numbers shown on the screen at the bottom of the screen there, choosing the number depending on whether or not there's a migrant involved in the issue. In terms of particularly the migrant exploitation, often people say to us, well, one of the things that holds us back is what happens to the workers when the issues are reported. So I'm not sure, many of you might be aware, but in case you're not, in terms of workers on an employer-supported work visa, recently there's been a new migrant exploitation protection work visa created. And so for this visa, if the migrants reported exploitation, they might be able to apply for it. And the visa will then allow them to quickly leave their job while the exploitation is being investigated. And with that visa, they will be able to work anywhere in New Zealand for any employer. The visa, this visa will be granted for up to 6 months, depending on the time remaining on the worker's current visa. And while they can't include dependent children in that visa application, they can apply for visas based on their relationship to the worker. Those people can apply for visas changes. So this slide really brings my presentation to a close. It was really just an introductory presentation about the types of issues we're seeing in terms of fair workplaces and the kinds of activities that perhaps you as a procurer could look at engaging with. Thank you for listening. And now let's move on to the next section, which is the Q&A.
Tanya, first of all, Ngā nui for that insightful presentation. I'm sure we all have learned something new today. I speak for myself, I certainly was quite mortified to know this is still happening in our mutu. Things such as the wage deductions and the Asian minimum wage as well. It's just very, very disturbing indeed. We have a few questions already, and now to all the audience attending today, if you have a question for Tanya, please remember to enter it in the Q&A box, and we'll be attending to them. Just to start things, we have a few questions for you already. Firstly, how are you defining ethical and sustainable?
Right, so from our context, we're defining ethical as meaning engaging in work practices that are legal, fair, and ensure decent treatment of your workforce by providing conditions that don't cause physical or mental harm to workers. And this includes at least meeting the minimum inputs. In terms of sustainable, what we're talking about is engaging in work practices that meet your current needs in a durable and lasting sort of way that doesn't compromise the future of your business and or your industry.
Thank you, Tanya. Second question, do your resources provide specific questions that can be asked as part of the procurement process?
Right. Yes, we do have that, and there's a particular resource on our website which is called Assuring Ethical and Sustainable Work Practices through Procurement, which provides lists of different questions that you can include at each stage of the process.
Excellent, thank you. Just a reminder to everybody, please put in your questions in the Q&A box. Much appreciated, thank you. We have a question from Knut as well. Firstly, great presentation, Tanya. Do you feel the government's supplier code of conduct is fit for purpose? That is, can it be improved?
That's a really bit of a tough question for us because, you know, we work alongside New Zealand government procurement. But we have been engaged in the supplier code of conduct to date, but we do think there could be possibly some improvements to it, which we've also engaged with government procurement on. Yeah, so yes, it's good that they've got a start, and yes, there could be some improvements made.
Thank you, Tanya. And also, will there be consultation on the model slavery legislation?
Yes, at this stage, I think the expectations are that there'll be consultation on the options early in the new year.
Oh, that's really good to hear. And especially when it comes to managing subcontractors, you know, it's always a big challenge itself. And it was quite, I was quite intrigued by the Chorus case itself. And is it very common, I suppose, especially in the construction or when you've got a large company, even those subcontractors, they can subcontract out again, you know, so it becomes like a chain reaction again. Yeah. Have you got measures in place for dealing with those, or is there a best practice approach?
So our resources do talk about that because we do see that that's a large part of the issue. It's often not necessarily your first tier suppliers and possibly not even your second tier suppliers. You know, like in the Chorus case, Chorus was supplying to government, and then they had, for the cases that we were investigating, it was primarily 2 subcontractors sitting underneath them, and then they had this, you know, huge, nearly 400 subbies underneath that, and that's where the issues were presenting. So one of the approaches that you can do is to be placing expectations around the same questions that you're asking your suppliers as a procurer, that your suppliers are asking their suppliers, because they're obviously procuring from those suppliers, so that you're having a drop down cascading sort of result. And I think like in the Chorus example, like the sort of whistleblowing line that they've put in place, you know, sits at the centre, and any of the employers, like 2 further levels down, are able to be you know, contacting into that line, and we're aware that that is a service that's still being utilised even today in that space. So you can do initiatives that transcend the supply chain.
Thank you, Tanya. And where can our audience go to get more information about the topic?
So I really encourage people to go to the Ethical and Sustainable Work Practices resources we have available on our Employment New Zealand website, and I have made that link available, so hopefully you guys can see. I think I can see it down there in the chat. Yes, Leah's provided it in the chat a little bit further up, so hopefully people are interested in that, they'll pop in there and have a look. And just want to encourage you, if you do have a look at those resources, and there is a lot on it, and you want to ask some questions or talk to people, please, you're welcome to reach out and make contact with us. we do have an interest in trying to help people to do better in this space, and so it's in all of our best interest for that to happen.
Yeah, that's excellent, Tanya. And just a reminder to everybody, if you can't find the Q&A box, then please just enter the question chat box as well. We'll certainly keep an eye on both of them. Okay, question from Knut again. Tanya, can you talk to us about what and how we should include relevant content in tender documentation? I think most of us are, however. Do you have anything you want to highlight?
I think that those resources I said earlier, they actually go down a list, and we've tried to make sure. So we appreciate that for procurers, your whole focus isn't just on contract of workers. Obviously, that's our whole focus. It's, you know, the part that we're passionate about and working on. But actually, your procurement needs to be holistic and cover all of the measures and considerations you need to. So in that resource that I mentioned earlier, we've tried to provide a fairly holistic but relatively short list of the real key questions that you should be looking at. And I think you should be able to get a link to that page as well. Or if you can't, I'll make sure that I provide one to CIPS for sharing with people after the presentation.
Excellent, excellent. And as part of this whole initiative that you have going, Tanya, and who were the people that you were, who were your stakeholders, and in terms of coming up with the whole strategy behind this? Did you have to do interviews? Did you have to consult various people? Could you just talk us through that little process? Okay.
Yeah, so done targeted engagements with different people. Interestingly, in the procurement space, we'd started doing some thinking in this space, and then many of you, if you're from government agencies, will be aware that one of the broader outcomes that government brought in a few years ago was around fair and safe workplaces and work practices. So we actually developed the resources that sit on the New Zealand Government Procurement site and that support that broader outcome in Rule 19 in respect of fair workplaces. So in that space, we engaged heavily with a number of government agencies actually outside of MB, so it included corrections, MSD and MPI in particular, because of where the focus was of government's interest in that space, which was around cleaning and security and forestry workers in the first instance. We then, in terms of the government procurement resources, they're very focused on employment standards, and employment standards being the minimum employment rights that are available. So we'd also been having questions in those discussions, though, about what about if you want to do more than that? And so our ethical and sustainable work practices resources, in terms of the procurer's approach, do have some suggestions about things you can do that also go beyond just the bare minimums. Because obviously, if you want to be a really good employer and getting up to being productive and best practice, then meeting the minimum employment standards isn't enough. It's enough to keep you sort of compliant, but it's not necessarily enough to get you to the best outcomes. And then for some of our other resources, which maybe are at the periphery of what you're interested in, like for the franchiser resources, we engaged with a number of franchisers and people from the Franchise Association. For our investors resources, we engaged with the likes of New Zealand Super Fund and ACC, who have two of the largest investment funds in New Zealand, and also with organisations like, say, Mindful Money, who have an interest in people making ethical and sustainable choices in terms of their KiwiSaver selection. So we've kind of gone out to pretty much anyone that we think's got a kind of shown a interest and a strong desire to be doing some good work in this space, and tried to learn from them and work with them to develop something that is practicable. So we are hoping that our resources are quite practicable, and we're really happy to receive feedback as well if people don't believe that's the case. We have an initiative underway right at the moment, which is to try and the resources we've got available, give them a little bit more plain Englishing, present them in a slightly more sexy format because they're a little bit bland at the moment. But yeah, any feedback people have would be gratefully accepted.
Excellent. And do you know of any examples of collaboration between the different stakeholders of the supply chain? For example, to address ethical issues, whether it's like a shared code of conduct or training programs, or with this bit of collaboration happening, essentially?
There is collaboration. Often you see really good collaboration, say at the industry body level. So one of the early cases in the sort of supply chain space where we identified issues and they rectified was in terms of apples and pears here in New Zealand. So in that case, there was a number of pack houses investigated, breaches found, relatively minor breaches found. The industry wasn't necessarily too bothered because they were quite minor. But when the Labour Inspectorate put out their media release, two things happened which got the industry really interested. One was that Procurers in the UK got in touch with the CE, apparently it was around midnight on the night of the video release, saying we want to know where your apples and pears in our supermarkets come from, and we want to be sure that our fruit's not tainted. And then apparently, a few weeks later, a major trading bank in New Zealand also got in touch with them, asking the same types of questions and saying they had concerns about the financial viability of the business. So that industry body was one of the first bodies that we really saw putting in place some really comprehensive work around building assurance throughout their supply chain. And then they wanted to make sure that first of all, they put in audits, but then realising that sometimes an audit doesn't give the full picture, they then worked with an organisation to create an employee voice tool. And what we've seen in that space is then the next sector that we were sort of engaging with in the cleaning sector, actually, the BSD who's an industry body in that sector, engaging with apples and pears and learning from the apples and pears experience about how they did things and what were some of the value that they got from like the employee voice tool, and then they were starting to talk to suppliers as well about that type of product. So we do see people coming together to share that kind of information.
Thanks, Tanya. Got another interesting question as well. So could you talk to us about how you work with immigration in New Zealand? Because quite often, I'm basing it on my experience, you've got migrants who don't have knowledge of legislation. There's different currencies involved as well, so they're quite vulnerable, in terms of being exploited. So essentially, what work do you do with immigration in New Zealand?
So the Labour Inspectorate works really closely with Immigration in New Zealand. They do joint operations in a number of places. And of course, we sit 2 floors apart in terms of the MB National Office building and co-located in many of our regional offices. In terms of the way we work together, we try to look to see who has the best tools and support services available for in terms of compliance and enforcement actions. There's also discussions around what happens when you do find migrants who are being exploited. And recently we've started up a migrant exploitation hotline. And that's an initiative that came out of the government's migrant exploitation prevention review. And both Immigration New Zealand and the Labour Inspectorate feed into discussions. There's a joint triaging that goes on, and then they're both involved in what happens.
Great. Thank you, Tanya. And as you know, in New Zealand, last time I checked, I think 90% of our businesses are less than 5 people. So your traditional SMEs, and especially in the construction sector, you have a lot of sole traders. So I don't think it's a matter of malice on their part, but simply a matter of capacity and bandwidth. So how do you empower them to carry out an audit of their supply chain. For example, they could be subcontracting as well. So it is a challenge not only for you, I imagine, but a challenge for New Zealand in general, just because of the makeup of our businesses, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's a huge challenge and one that we haven't solved yet. So whoever asked that question, great question.
Yeah.
We try to do some work with biz.gov.nz, who have a role in trying to get information out in a way that's more accessible to smaller and medium-sized enterprises. We also are currently working on an initiative which has a number of different private and public sector entities engaged in it, and it's kind of been pulled together by the Sustainable Business Network, which is about trying to create a sustainable procurement sort of toolkit. So we kind of at the start, we sort of maybe a little bit akin to the climate action toolbox that's available on the biz.gov.nz website, but somewhere a relatively simple tool that a small business could go into to try and think about their ESG type expectations and what they're doing, and to try and help them figure out where they might like to put in some more effort and what that might look like. So that's a tool that is currently being prototyped through Creative HQ and with the Lightning Labs. And we're hoping to see something out of that in the not too distant future.
That's really good, Tanya. And as I promised to keep on time, the very last question for you. Finally, Tanya, as a way of closing today's session, could you please summarize your top 3 tips or takeaways for our audience, or provide any closing comments?
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Avi. I guess in closing, I'd like to leave the audience with a thought, which is, considering the compliance of your supply chain with relevant employment law can be essential, to the continuation of your organisation's ability to operate. And besides exposing workers to unsafe and unfair behaviour, when there are incidents of non-compliance in the supply chain, you can jeopardise the quality of products and services that you procure, and it can have a really significant impact on your organisation's brand, reputation, and sales revenue. So I guess my thought was, if you're already doing it, great. And actually your poll showed that maybe lots of people on this call are already doing it. So that's fantastic. But for those people or organisations that aren't doing this already, why not start now?
Thank you for that, Tanya. And once again, Tanya, Ngā thank you very much for your valuable time today. We certainly appreciate how much time and effort goes behind putting a webinar like this. And on behalf of CIPS, we would like to thank you sincerely for the knowledge that you shared with us today. It's certainly a topic that is very close to most of our hearts, not just as good citizens, but it is our moral sort of obligation and responsibility to ensure these things are addressed and dealt with, essentially. So truly appreciated the topic today and for sharing all that knowledge with us today. And thank you to all our audience today for joining us today as well. This webinar has been recorded and will be available as a learning tool for our members and extended procurement and supply community to tap into the future. It will also be available on the official CIPS YouTube channel under Australia and New Zealand playlist. And before we finish off, just a quick note from us. The New Zealand Procurement Excellence Awards is coming to you virtually on the 9th of December at 6 p.m. ANZ time. Gives me great pleasure to announce that CIPS will be sponsoring the Most Effective Team Award. Sharon Morris, our GM of CIPS ANZ, will be another winner for this category. And we look forward to seeing you there. And lastly, a big ngā mihi mahuia to all of you for joining us today and being part of this session. I know that the lockdown has not been easy, so kia kaha, my friends, and please take a moment to complete the post-webinar survey as you leave. It will pop up on your screen before you exit. Until next time, Have a very nice day. And thank you, everyone, once again.